deficit that the federal government runs has to be even larger in order for you and I to, experience surpluses, or the businesses to experience surpluses. And that's the huge problem right now, is that these, because tax revenues have collapsed across the board, state and local governments have lost all this money. They need money directly from the federal government to get them out of their fiscal troubles.
Okay, and so let's just be clear. We have fiscal and monetary policy. These are two basically they're related, but they're not the same. Will you just make that distinction clear to people, because we're going to be talking about monetary policy as opposed to fiscal policy, right, in this conversation for the most part.
Yeah. So fiscal policy is exactly what we've just been talking about. Spending and taxing. It's what gives us surpluses. If the government runs a deficit, we get a surplus. As we've just been talking about. Monetary policy is different, because monetary policy doesn't directly affect whether people are running surpluses or deficits. Instead, monetary policy is about the terms at which they can finance their debts or finance their deficit. Monetary policy is, we're going to buy a whole bunch of government bonds to lower interest rates. Monetary policy, as we'll be talking about, is we're going to buy a whole bunch of bonds from the corporate sector to lower the interest rate that they pay and make sure they have access to finance. Monetary policy is, we can buy the debts of state and local governments to make sure that they lower the interest rate that they pay, and that they can find finance. But that isn't mean that they don't have, that they suddenly have a surplus when they did have a deficit when you conduct monetary policy, when you do these purchases and sales. Instead, it's just affecting the financing, which is important, but it can't replace lost income. And that'll be, previewing something we'll talk a lot more about, is that you can have all the monetary policy in the world, but if a company has lost a whole ton of income and has a big deficit, the monetary policy won't make that deficit go away.
Right. It might keep you afloat for a while, but at one point you're going to have to deal with it. Yeah. All right. And just to be clear, broadly speaking, Congress deals with fiscal policy, and the Fed deals with monetary policy.
Exactly.
And but there's also a relationship between the Treasury and the Fed that begins to sort of arguably blur that line a little bit.
Yeah. So I would say, I just described monetary policy as purchase and sale policy, where you purchase financial assets and you sell financial assets out there. Well, the Treasury, not when it spends or taxes or is involved in the spending and taxing process, doesn't blur those lines. But when it engages in sales, when it sells financial assets, it absolutely is blurring that line. And the big time that they do that is when they sell Treasury securities. That process where you're selling Treasury securities, and there's a whole bunch of net issuance out there, that's affecting interest rates for if they sell 10-year bonds, that affects interest rates for 10-year bonds. And the Federal Reserve has to respond. And so, if the Federal Reserve selling a Treasury security is monetary policy, then, arguably, I would make the case that the Treasury doing that is monetary policy. And it leads to some complications, because the Treasury thinks of its job mainly as, financing federal spending, as making sure that the federal government can make its bills. And so it uses these Treasury securities to do that, because that's the main instrument outside of a couple others we could name that it can use to do that. But the Federal Reserve thinks of it as a monetary policy instrument. It thinks of it as these bonds as a way to affect interest rates, and that leads to some tension. There's been conflict over the decades between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury over their different outlooks over how they should deal with Treasury securities.
Okay. So, and just to be, let me just, reduce this down so that I can understand it. When we say Treasury security, we're talking about, generally speaking, like bonds. We're going to borrow money. And the way we're going to borrow money is we're going to sell, Janet and Steve a bond for $100 that they're going to give Sam for his bar mitzvah. And in 20 years, it'll be worth $100. They paid $75. We're going to give them interest. So basically, they're giving us a loan, the government a loan, and we're going to pay it back with interest in 20 years. And Sam's going to get this like a little bond. Obviously, the bonds are a little bit bigger and they get sold to other people, but that's the dynamic that's going on there. And when the Treasury starts to sell these bonds, they set interest rates on them and they'll do them at different terms. This will be, $100 in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. And that impacts how much money is out there because it allows the government to deficit spend. And that adds a surplus in the private sector. And therefore, it begins to implicate monetary policy that the Feds, it's sort of like the Feds arena. So it's like Fed's a big bank, but the Treasury is such a big client that they can impact it. Is that it?
Yeah, a little bit. One thing I would say there is that, I would separate the selling of the Treasury security from the deficit. So, that the selling the Treasury security is, will potentially enable them to deficit spend at a later time or, meet payments at a later date. But the selling of the Treasury security itself doesn't affect those balances out there. They sell a Treasury security to the private sector. The private sector say, hands over cash or hands over a bank deposit, whatever it is. That's exchange of one financial asset for another. Nothing happens in terms of deficits or surpluses. It's only later when the federal government goes out and spends that, it's running a deficit. And that's important because we can, as I've been writing a lot about recently, we can rearrange these relationships. We can, say, this is stupid. Why are we, having the Treasury be responsible for it, for issuing this instrument? Because, the Federal Reserve should really be in charge of selling bonds because it's the one that's concerned about interest rates. It's the one that wants, to set certain interest rates on a 10-year bond or a 20-year bond. It's the one that was worried about how many 10-year bonds are circulating in the private sector. It's the one that wants to manage all these processes, and what it would do to choose to do that is different than what the Treasury would choose. And while from the Treasury's point of view, it's looking at this as, the national debt that it's using to finance itself. But the Federal Reserve and the financiers that the Federal Reserve interacts with is looking at a Treasury security and saying, this is the safest asset in the world. If I want to put $100 million somewhere and I want to guarantee that I'm not going to lose my money, what I want to do is buy a Treasury security. I can't put it in a bank because the bank has insurance, has deposit insurance caps. So my big option, if I want to make sure that I have $100 million and I'll have $100 million in 20 years, is by buying a bond. And that role of being a safe asset, of being, providing something to investors, is what the Federal Reserve really cares about. And, the decisions it would make would be different than the Treasury would make. And in the meantime, as we can talk about in a bit, everyone gets very confused or gets worried about the national debt and isn't thinking about it the way the financiers and the central bankers are thinking.
And the reason why I think that my $100 billion is going to be there in 20 years is because the U.S. government has the ability to tax a massive population, essentially, that is highly productive. And that makes it the safest bet in the world. Is that basically it?
And that it's then not only that, but you can that the federal government will create dollars and absolutely make its payments no matter what. That you can rely on the federal government is going to make its payments, and the money you get at the end of that process is going to be valuable because of the system of payments that are denominated in dollars. There's so many countries around the world that owe dollars and corporations and banks around the world that owes dollars. There's a huge population within the United States that owes dollars in all these different ways, that you can rely not just that, some bureaucrat is going to, quote unquote, print money and, and provide you money, but that money is probably going to have, still be valuable, 10, 20 years down the line.
All right. And lastly, I mean, just this idea, that the people, in the wake of the financial crisis, I remember going on TV with David Stockman, who was the Office of Budget Management Director under Reagan. And he would come on and he would say, PIMCO, which is the biggest bond buyer, I guess, or one of the biggest bond buyers in the country, is selling their bonds, and the by July we're going to have rampant inflation, and I think this was in 2010 or 11, I can't remember when it was, and everything's going to crash, and there's going to be inflation, and people won't want to buy our bonds anymore. And so when you say that, when people like that are worried about stuff, they're not looking at it in the way that investors do, because none of those things happened. I mean, Glenn Beck and there was a whole industry out there telling us that we were going to turn into the Weimar Republic because of quantitative easing and whatnot, which is and none of that happened. So
yeah, no, the people who bet against Treasury securities lost a lot of money.
And okay, so with all that said, tell us what the Fed has been doing now and what it needs to do going forward from your perspective. There have been three major, as far as I can tell from reading you and obviously reading the news, there have been three major things that the Fed has done, some of which is sort of radically new for the Fed. That's the Main Street Lending Program, the Paycheck Protection Liquidity Facility, and the Municipal Liquidity Program. And then you also talk a lot about alternative accounting. Let's start with, I don't know, which one of those do you want to start with that makes it easiest for you?
I think the three big ones are what I would say is, instead of the paycheck protection one, it's the corporate credit facilities.
Okay,
There's
right.
These two
right.
corporate credit facilities, and those, so that's the big picture. The big picture is the Fed is experimenting with something which isn't completely unprecedented in its history, but is pretty rare, which is direct lending to small and medium-sized businesses. The Main Street Lending Program. It's got these corporate credit facilities, which is also pretty unprecedented for them, which is buying corporate bonds, both on the secondary market, meaning from private financiers who are holding them or speculating on them, and directly from corporations. And then the third one is the Municipal Liquidity Facility, which is buying state and local government securities. And all of these, in some degree or another, are pretty unprecedented for the Fed, but the Main Street Lending Program is the biggest one, is definitely the biggest kind of, outside, where it's the most uncomfortable.
Okay. So I want to just say this too. This is not a substitute, obviously, for fiscal, well, it can have some substitution, I guess, effects, but we're focusing on this, but we should also say that obviously there needs to be fiscal actions too. Congress needs to support support people as well in spending. But we're just focusing on this with the Fed right now because our government is completely incapable of getting its crap together on some level, and there's more independence by the Fed, it seems like.
Yeah,
and so
that's the big picture here. The big picture here is monetary policy would have a role in this crisis, but the focus on it and how much it's doing relative to how much Congress and the rest of the federal government is doing is completely lopsided. The fundamental problem from a macroeconomic point of view, the fallout from the virus is that a whole bunch of businesses and households and also state and local governments have lost a tremendous amount of income because we've quote unquote shut down the economy, because we've shut down these public spaces, because a whole ton of people have lost their jobs, and the knock-on effects from that, millions upon millions upon millions, unprecedented level of job losses in the last 2 months, and that process, the thing that we ultimately need to deal with that problem is income, and as we've just been talked about, when when the federal government runs a deficit, the rest of the economy runs a surplus. We